The summer sun beat down on the cobblestones outside Buckingham Palace as tourists from around the world gathered to catch a glimpse of the famous Queen's Guard. The air buzzed with excitement, cameras clicked, children pointed, and visitors spoke in hushed whispers about the Guard's legendary discipline. At his post stood a young Guardsman, tall and proud in his pristine red uniform. His bearskin cap sat perfectly straight, and his polished boots gleamed in the afternoon light. 6 years of service had taught him exactly how to stand still for hours, how to ignore the ache in his feet, and most importantly, how to maintain that famous stone-faced expression no matter what happened around him. Today seemed like any other day at first. A group of Japanese tourists bowed respectfully before taking photos. A young couple from Brazil posed for selfies nearby, trying their best to catch the Guard in the background. 2 small children from France waved excitedly, hoping to catch even the tiniest reaction, but of course there was none. The Guard's mind wandered to his family as he stood there. He thought about his grandmother, who'd cried tears of joy at his graduation ceremony, and his little sister, who boasted to all her friends about her big brother protecting the palace. These thoughts helped him stay focused during the long hours of duty. The morning crowd started to thin out as lunchtime approached. That's when the atmosphere began to change. A new group of tourists arrived, and among them was a man who would turn this ordinary day into something unprecedented. He stood out immediately, not because of his bright clothing or expensive camera, but because of the way he carried himself, like he owned the ground he walked on. The Guard could hear him before he could see him, a loud voice cutting through the respectful murmur of the crowd, making comments about everything from the weather to the architecture. But there was something in his tone that made the other tourists step away slightly, creating a small bubble of space around him. Nobody knew it yet, but in the next few minutes, something would happen that would test not just the Guard's training, but his character in ways he never expected. The clouds shifted overhead, casting dramatic shadows across the palace grounds, almost as if nature itself was setting the stage for what was about to unfold. Other guards at their posts noticed the change in atmosphere too. The police officers who regularly patrolled the area slowed their walks ever so slightly, their experienced instincts telling them to pay closer attention. The usual tourist chatter grew quieter, like the hushed moment in a theater just before the curtain rises. The Guard continued his post, perfectly still, perfectly professional, unaware that in just moments he would become part of a story that would touch hearts around the world. His training had prepared him for many things, but nothing quite like this. The summer breeze carried the sound of distant traffic and the rustle of leaves from the palace gardens. Time seemed to slow down, each second stretching longer than the last. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the events about to unfold would prove that sometimes the most powerful moments in life come when we least expect them. The tourist in the Hawaiian shirt stood out from the crowd like a splash of paint on a blank canvas. His expensive camera hung around his neck, swinging with each exaggerated gesture he made. At first, his comments were just loud enough for those nearest to him to hear, little remarks about the Guard's appearance that made nearby visitors uncomfortable. A young mother pulled her children closer, shooting disapproving glances his way. An elderly couple from Canada slowly stepped back, their faces showing concern. The tourist's voice grew louder with each passing minute, his words becoming more pointed, more purposefully hurtful. His Texan accent carried across the courtyard as he made remarks about the Guard's skin color, each comment more inappropriate than the last. 2 teenage girls from Sweden stopped their selfie-taking and looked at each other with wide eyes. A group of university students from India lowered their cameras, their excited chatter dying down to worried whispers. The usual happy buzz of the tourist crowd transformed into an uneasy silence, broken only by the man's increasingly hostile voice. "What's wrong with him?" a small child asked his father, tugging at his sleeve. The father quietly hushed his son, but the question hung in the air, echoing what everyone was thinking. Several phones were now pointed at the scene, recording what was unfolding. Some people typed furiously on their phones, likely sharing the incident on social media in real time. A group of British schoolchildren on a field trip watched with a mixture of shock and sadness. Their teacher tried to usher them away, but they remained rooted to the spot, witnessing a real-life lesson about prejudice that no classroom could have prepared them for. One of the students, no more than 12, wiped tears from her eyes as she watched the guard maintain his composure. The tourist's friend tried to pull him away, clearly embarrassed by the situation. "Come on, man, that's enough," he said, tugging at his companion's arm. But the man shrugged him off, his face reddening with each passing moment. His camera swung wildly as he gestured, the strap tangling around his arm. 2 police officers in the distance began walking towards the scene, their pace quickening as the situation escalated. The crowd parted to let them through, but they were still too far away to intervene immediately. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The guard remained motionless, his eyes fixed forward, his posture perfect. Only those standing very close might have noticed the slight tightening of his jaw, the almost imperceptible straightening of his already impeccable posture. His discipline was remarkable, but the cost of maintaining it was written in the barely visible tension in his shoulders. Several tourists had their hands over their mouths in shock. Others looked around desperately, hoping someone would step in and stop this display of hatred. An older gentleman in a business suit took a step forward, about to say something, but before he could speak, the situation took an even more serious turn. The tourist, frustrated by the guard's lack of reaction, did something that made everyone's hearts skip a beat. He moved toward the barrier that separated the public from the guard's post. The crowd held its collective breath. In all the years of the Queen's Guard's history, this moment would soon prove to be one that no one would forget. Time seemed to slow down as the tourist's hand reached for the barrier. The sun disappeared behind a cloud, casting a dramatic shadow over the scene. In the distance, a church bell began to toll, its deep rings adding to the gravity of the moment. What happened next would not only change the lives of everyone present, but would become a powerful lesson about dignity, duty, and the strength it takes to face hatred with grace. The atmosphere around Buckingham Palace had transformed from a tourist attraction into something that felt more like a powder keg waiting to explode. The man's words grew sharper, each one cutting through the air like a knife. His face had turned an angry shade of red, matching the guard's uniform, though for entirely different reasons. People in the crowd began to react more openly now. A group of American tourists who had been taking photos lowered their cameras, their expressions changing from excitement to concern. "This isn't right," whispered one woman to her husband, who nodded grimly. Their teenage son looked down at his feet, unable to watch what was unfolding before him. 2 elderly British ladies who had been enjoying their afternoon tea on a nearby bench stood up, their faces lined with worry. One of them clutched her handbag tightly, her knuckles turning white. The other reached for her phone, her hands shaking slightly as she dialed for help. They had visited this spot every Thursday for years, but they'd never witnessed anything like this. The guard stood perfectly still, his training evident in every muscle that didn't twitch, every finger that didn't move. But those who looked closely could see small signs of the internal battle he was fighting. A tiny bead of sweat rolled down his temple, though the day wasn't particularly warm. His chest rose and fell with carefully measured breaths, each one a silent count to maintain his composure. A young couple who had been planning to propose at this very spot slowly backed away, their romantic moment overshadowed by the ugliness of the situation. The small velvet box in the young man's pocket would have to wait for another day, another time when love could properly triumph over hate. Several tourists had their phones out now, recording everything. In the age of social media, they knew this moment would soon be shared with the world. But unlike the usual tourist videos of guards standing still or making their precise movements, this recording would capture something far more significant, a test of human dignity in the face of blatant disrespect. The police officers were getting closer now, their pace quickening as they assessed the situation. One of them spoke quietly into his radio, calling for backup. They could see what everyone else could see. This was more than just an unruly tourist. This was a moment that could either end in tragedy or triumph, depending on how the next few minutes played out. A school group that had been excitedly chattering about the palace's history fell silent. Their teacher, who had planned to give them a lesson about British tradition, found herself instead witnessing a different kind of teaching moment. She watched as her students' faces showed a mix of confusion, anger, and sadness, knowing this would be a day they would remember for reasons she hadn't anticipated. In the distance, the sound of palace guards changing shifts could be heard, their boots clicking against the pavement in perfect unison. The familiar sound seemed to emphasize just how unusual this situation was. While one tradition continued unchanged, another tradition, that of respect and decorum, was being severely tested. The tourist's friend made one last attempt to pull him away. "You're making a fool of yourself," he hissed, clearly mortified by his companion's behavior. But his words fell on deaf ears. The man was too far gone in his own anger, too caught up in his attempt to provoke a reaction from the stoic guard. A light breeze ruffled the guard's bearskin cap, the only movement visible in his otherwise perfectly still form. Above, dark clouds began to gather, as if nature itself was responding to the tension below. The famous palace walls seemed to loom larger than ever, silent witnesses to this modern drama playing out in their shadow. Time seemed to move differently now. Each second stretched out like an hour, each minute felt like a day. The crowd had grown larger, drawn by some instinct that told them they were about to witness something important. Nobody knew exactly what would happen next, but everyone could feel that they were present for a moment that would be remembered long after this day was done. Nobody saw it coming, but looking back, perhaps they should have. The tourist, his face now a deep shade of purple, had been inching closer to the barrier with each passing minute. His expensive camera swung wildly from his neck as he gestured, forgotten in his growing frustration at the guard's unwavering stillness. A young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, asking in a whispered voice, "Why is that man so angry, Mummy?" The mother couldn't find the words to explain. How do you tell a child about the darkness that sometimes lives in people's hearts? She simply pulled him closer, shielding him from the scene unfolding before them. The crowd had grown even larger now, forming a loose circle around the area. Some watched with phones raised, while others stood with hands covering their mouths in shock. A street vendor who had been selling ice cream nearby had stopped his cheerful calls, his bells falling silent as he watched the scene with growing concern. Then it happened. The tourist took that fatal step. His foot crossed over the barrier, that sacred line that had stood as a symbol of respect between the public and the guards for generations. The sound of his shoe scuffing against the metal barrier seemed to echo across the courtyard, though it was barely louder than a whisper. Time seemed to freeze. A flock of pigeons that had been pecking at crumbs nearby took flight, startled by the sudden movement. Their wings created a soft whooshing sound that cut through the tense silence. The sun peeked out from behind a cloud, casting harsh shadows that made everything look more dramatic. 2 police officers were now running towards the scene, their radios crackling with urgent messages. But they were still too far away to prevent what was about to happen. The tourist's friend had given up trying to stop him and now stood back, his face a mask of embarrassment and horror. An elderly man who had been explaining the history of the guards to his grandchildren suddenly stopped mid-sentence. His walking stick trembled slightly in his grip as he watched the unthinkable unfold. His grandchildren, sensing the gravity of the moment, pressed closer to him, their eyes wide with uncertainty. The guard remained motionless, but something had changed. There was a subtle shift in the air around him, like the quiet before a storm. His eyes, which had been fixed forward as his training demanded, held a new intensity. Years of discipline and training were about to be tested in a way that no manual could have prepared him for. A group of international students who had been sketching the palace for their art class slowly lowered their pencils. One of them, without looking away from the scene, reached for her phone to record what was happening. The lead of her pencil broke with a soft snap as she set it down, the sound barely noticeable in the growing tension. The tourist was now fully over the barrier, his feet planted firmly on the wrong side of the line. His voice had grown louder, more demanding, as if crossing that physical boundary had removed all remaining restraint. The words he spewed were ugly things that seemed to stain the very air around them. A church bell somewhere in the distance began to toll, marking the hour. Each deep, resonant ring seemed to count down to something inevitable. The usual bustling sounds of London traffic felt muffled and far away, as if the world itself was holding its breath to see what would happen next. The guards' fellow servicemen at their posts could see what was happening, but they too were bound by duty and protocol. Their stillness spoke volumes about the discipline it took to maintain their positions while watching their colleague face this challenge alone. What happened next would be replayed on news channels around the world. It would be shared millions of times on social media, discussed in homes and offices, and used as a teaching moment in schools and military academies alike. But in that moment, nobody knew what was coming. They only knew they were witnessing something extraordinary, something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about strength, dignity, and the power of restraint. The moment hung in the air like a delicate glass ball, ready to shatter at the slightest touch. Everyone expected the guard to call for backup, to raise his weapon, or to make some kind of aggressive move to protect his post. That's what the tourist wanted, a reaction, any reaction that would justify his behavior. But what happened next left everyone speechless. The guard moved with the smooth precision that comes from years of training. His movement was so supple that some in the crowd almost missed it. He turned his head just slightly and looked directly into the tourist's eyes. The simple action sent ripples of surprise through the watching crowd. In all their years of watching the Queen's Guard, no one had ever seen anything quite like this. His voice, when it came, was unexpected. Not harsh or angry, but clear and calm, carrying easily across the now silent courtyard. "Sir," he said, his words measured and deliberate, "I stand here representing centuries of tradition and service. My uniform doesn't see color, and neither should you. If you'd like to learn about the history of this post, I'd be happy to share it with you after my duty ends." The tourist's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He had expected anger, had hoped for it even. But this response, this dignity, hit him harder than any shout could have. His camera, which had been swinging wildly moments before, now hung limp against his chest. A young girl in the crowd tugged at her father's sleeve. "Daddy," she whispered, though in the silence everyone could hear her, "that's what you meant about being brave, isn't it?" Her father nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. The police officers who had been rushing forward slowed their pace, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding. One of them, a veteran of 20 years on the force, would later say he had never seen a situation diffused so perfectly. The guard's fellow servicemen remained at attention, but there was a new pride in their stance. This wasn't in any training manual, but it was perhaps the finest display of military bearing any of them had ever witnessed. An older woman in the crowd dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. She had lived through the civil rights movement, had seen both the worst and best of humanity. "This," she said to no one in particular, "this is how you change hearts." The tourist's friend, who had been watching in horrified embarrassment, stepped forward now. He placed a gentle hand on his companion's shoulder. The touch seemed to break whatever spell of hatred had possessed the man, and his shoulders slumped. The sun broke through the clouds at that moment, casting a warm glow over the scene. It felt like nature itself was applauding the guard's response. A light breeze carried the scent of roses from the palace gardens, somehow making the moment even more poignant. The crowd had grown larger still, drawn by some instinct that told them they were witnessing something important. Phones were recording, but many people had lowered their devices, wanting to experience this moment with their own eyes rather than through a screen. The guard resumed his position, face forward, as still as ever. But something had changed in the atmosphere. The tension had dissolved, replaced by something else: respect, admiration, and perhaps most importantly, understanding. A teacher who had been watching with her class quickly pulled out her notebook. This wasn't the history lesson she had planned to give today, but it was perhaps the most valuable one her students would ever receive. "Sometimes," she whispered to her students, "the strongest person isn't the one who fights back, but the one who shows us a better way." The tourist's face had turned from angry red to a deep shade of crimson, but this time it wasn't from anger, it was from shame. His expensive camera hung forgotten around his neck as he stood there, the weight of his actions suddenly heavy on his shoulders. The crowd watched as the realization of what he'd done washed over him like a wave. Phones all around the courtyard had captured the moment, and already the videos were being shared across social media platforms. A young influencer who had come to film her usual cheerful travel content found herself instead posting something far more meaningful. Her hands shook slightly as she typed out the caption, "Just witnessed a moment that restored my faith in humanity." The applause started softly at first, just a few claps from somewhere in the back of the crowd. Then it grew, spreading like ripples in a pond until the entire courtyard was filled with the sound. It wasn't the usual tourist applause for a guard's march or ceremony. This was different, deeper, more meaningful. An older gentleman in a worn tweed jacket wiped his eyes behind his glasses. He'd served in the military himself decades ago and understood exactly what it had taken for the guard to respond the way he did. "That right there," he said to his grandson, "is what real courage looks like." Several people stepped forward, wanting to shake the guard's hand, but stopped themselves, remembering his duty wasn't over. Instead, they stood back respectfully, some offering small nods of acknowledgement, others simply staying to witness this remarkable moment. The tourist's friend finally found his voice. "We should go," he said quietly, gently guiding his companion away from the scene. The tourist moved like a man waking from a dream, or perhaps a nightmare of his own making. Each step seemed to carry the weight of his regret. A group of schoolchildren who had witnessed everything stood quietly, their usual chatter replaced by thoughtful expressions. One little boy tugged at his teacher's sleeve and asked, "Can we write about this for our essay on heroes?" The teacher smiled, knowing this would be a lesson her students would carry with them far longer than anything from their textbooks. The police officers who had arrived at the scene were now talking quietly among themselves, clearly impressed. One of them was seen making notes, not for an incident report, but because he wanted to remember exactly how this situation had been handled so perfectly. Nearby, a coffee shop owner who had stepped outside to watch the commotion was offering free drinks to people in the crowd. "Some moments need to be remembered," she said as she handed out steaming cups. The warm drinks seemed to help people process what they'd just witnessed, creating small circles of conversation where strangers shared their thoughts and feelings about what they'd seen. The summer breeze carried snippets of conversations from around the courtyard. "Did you see how he kept his dignity? I've never seen anything like it. This is what we should be teaching our children." The words floated through the air like leaves in the wind, each carrying a seed of change. The guard maintained his post, perfectly still once again, but the air around him felt different now. There was a new kind of respect in the way people looked at him, something deeper than the usual tourist curiosity. Every now and then, someone would step forward to take a photo, but they did so with more reverence than before, understanding that they were capturing something more significant than just a man in a ceremonial uniform. A woman who had been sketching the palace quickly added something to her drawing, not the buildings or the crowds, but a simple figure standing straight and proud, representing everything that had just happened. Years later, that sketch would hang in her studio, reminding her of the day she witnessed strength in its purest form. In the days that followed, the incident outside Buckingham Palace became more than just another viral video. The guard's response sparked conversations in living rooms, classrooms, and offices around the world. People who watched the video found themselves sharing it not for the conflict, but for the powerful message of dignity it contained. The tourist, back in his hotel room that evening, couldn't sleep. The guard's words kept echoing in his mind. After tossing and turning for hours, he sat down at the hotel desk and began writing. His hands trembled as he typed out a public apology on his social media accounts. "Today, I learned what true strength looks like," he wrote. "It wasn't in my anger or my words, but in the dignity of the man I tried to hurt." News channels picked up the story, but not for the usual reasons. Instead of focusing on the conflict, they highlighted the guard's remarkable response. A morning show host wiped away tears after playing the clip, saying, "In a world where we're so quick to respond to hatred with more hatred, this shows us another way." Back at the palace, something had changed. Tourists still came to take photos with the guards, but there was a new respect in their approach. Parents could be heard explaining to their children not just about the tradition of the guards, but about the importance of treating everyone with dignity, regardless of their differences. The guard's commanding officer called a special meeting. Looking around at the assembled servicemen and women, he spoke quietly but firmly. "What happened yesterday wasn't in any training manual," he said, "but it will be now." The room filled with murmurs of approval as he announced that the incident would become part of their training program, teaching future guards about maintaining both their discipline and their humanity. A local school teacher brought her class to the palace a week later. Standing where the incident had happened, she asked her students what they thought about strength. A quiet boy at the back of the group raised his hand. "Real strength," he said, "is being able to be kind when others are mean." The teacher smiled, knowing that some lessons can't be found in textbooks. The tourist's video apology went viral too, but for different reasons. People were moved by his honesty and willingness to admit his mistakes. Comments poured in from around the world, many sharing their own stories of transformation and learning. One comment stood out: "It takes courage to admit when we're wrong. Thank you for showing that change is possible." A young filmmaker who had captured the entire incident created a short documentary. Instead of focusing on the conflict, she highlighted the moments of human connection that followed: the crowd's reaction, the quiet tears, the spontaneous applause. The film won several awards, but more importantly, it became a tool for teaching conflict resolution in schools and community centers. The god himself remained humble about the whole thing. When his shift ended that evening, he did exactly what he had promised. He spent time explaining the history of his post to anyone who wanted to listen. A small crowd gathered, hanging on his every word as he spoke about tradition, duty, and the importance of understanding one another. Months later, a small plaque appeared near the god's post. It didn't mention the incident specifically, but its message was clear. Standing here are men and women who guard not just a palace, but the values of dignity, respect, and understanding that make us all human. The tourist returned to the palace 6 months later, not to cause trouble, but to make amends. He stood quietly in the crowd, watching the changing of the god ceremony with new eyes. When asked by another tourist if he ever visited before, he simply smiled and said, "Yes, and I learned the most important lesson of my life here." The story continues to be shared, not as a tale of conflict, but as a reminder that sometimes the most powerful response to hatred is unwavering dignity and an offer of understanding. It serves as proof that even in our most challenging moments, we have the choice to rise above anger and show others a better way.